The North Atlantic in November 1942 was a graveyard that stretched 3,000 miles across black water. It was here, in the mid-Atlantic Gap, that terrible stretch of ocean beyond the reach of Allied air cover, that the Battle of the Atlantic reached its most desperate hour. German U-boats prowled these waters with near impunity, sinking merchant ships faster than the Allies could build them. The mathematics were brutal and simple. If Britain couldn't receive supplies across this ocean, the island nation would starve, and Nazi Germany would win the war. HMS Bluebell was one of hundreds of Flower-class corvettes built in frantic haste to escort the convoys that kept Britain alive. At 205 feet long and displacing just over 1,000 tons, she was small, uncomfortable, and rolled viciously in heavy seas. Her crew of 85 men lived in constant damp, slept in hammocks that never dried, and ate food that tasted of diesel fuel because the galley ventilation shared ducts with the engine room. But she was tough, seaworthy, and armed with depth charges, a 4-inch gun, and the determination of men who knew that every ship they protected carried the difference between survival and surrender. On November 18, 1942, HMS Bluebell was 800 miles west of Ireland, escorting convoy HX-217, 43 merchant ships carrying aviation fuel, ammunition, tinned food, and timber from Halifax, Nova Scotia, to Liverpool. The convoy moved at 8 knots, the speed of its slowest ship, arranged in 9 columns with 4 corvettes and 2 destroyers prowling the perimeter like sheepdogs watching for wolves. At 0340 hours, in absolute darkness and mounting seas, HMS Bluebell's propeller struck something in the water. The sound that followed was something no sailor ever wanted to hear, a deep, grinding vibration that ran through the entire hull like a scream transmitted through steel. Chief Engineer Duncan McAllister, a 48-year-old Glaswegian who'd spent 30 years at sea, knew immediately what it meant. He hit the emergency stop, shutting down the single Scotch Marine boiler and triple expansion steam engine before the damaged propeller could tear the reduction gear apart. Within 60 seconds, HMS Bluebell was dead in the water. The convoy steamed on without her. It had to. The cardinal rule of convoy operations was absolute. Never stop, never turn back, never risk 43 ships for one. By 0400 hours, HMS Bluebell sat alone in the darkness, rolling heavily in 12-foot swells. Her position radioed to Naval Command in Liverpool with a request for immediate towing assistance. The response came 3 hours later. No tugs available for minimum 72 hours. Weather deteriorating. U-boat activity high. Reduce crew to skeleton complement. Destroy confidential materials. Prepare to abandon ship if necessary. In the wardroom, Lieutenant Commander Richard Thornhill read the signal twice, his weathered face showing nothing. He was 36 years old, a merchant Navy officer recalled to service, and he'd already lost 1 ship to a U-boat off Gibraltar. He knew what prepare to abandon ship meant. It meant headquarters had written them off. It meant HMS Bluebell would likely be found by a U-boat before any rescue arrived. It meant 85 men would take their chances in life rafts in November water that killed in minutes. He called a meeting of his officers and senior ratings in the cramped wardroom. The ship rolled 30 degrees to port, sending coffee mugs sliding across the table. Outside, the wind was building, and the sky was the color of slate. "Gentlemen," Thornhill said quietly, "we have a bent propeller blade, no power, and no rescue for 3 days. The engineering assessment is that we cannot run the engines without destroying the reduction gear. That means we're a sitting target." He paused, letting that sink in. "I'm requesting volunteers to stay aboard. Everyone else transfers to HMS Gladiolus when she makes her return sweep at 1800 hours. I'll stay. I need the engine room crew, the gun crew, and enough hands to work the ship if we get a tow. 20 men, no more." The silence that followed wasn't about fear. Every man in that room had already made peace with death the day he volunteered for Corvette duty. The silence was about mathematics and fairness, about who would stay and who would be ordered to safety. Able seaman Thomas Hewitt wasn't in the wardroom. He was on the afterdeck, staring at the propeller shaft housing. Thomas Hewitt was 23 years old, born in Portsmouth to a family of dockyard workers. His father had built destroyers in the Great War. His grandfather had served on HMS Victory as a carpenter's mate when she was still a functioning ship of the line. The Hewitts understood ships the way farmers understood soil. It was in the blood, passed down through generations in the form of stories, skills, and an almost mystical understanding of how wood and metal behaved under stress. Thomas had joined the Navy in 1940, 2 months after Dunkirk, when Britain stood alone and invasion seemed certain. He'd volunteered for Corvette duty because destroyers required mathematical education he didn't have, and Corvettes needed men who could splice cable, repair pumps, and jury-rig solutions to problems that would baffle a trained engineer. He was good with his hands, patient with machinery, and possessed of that rare quality that made the difference between competent sailors and exceptional ones. He could look at a broken thing and see not what it was, but what it could become. Now, as dawn broke gray and cold over the North Atlantic, Thomas studied the propeller problem with the intensity of a surgeon examining a patient. The shaft housing was accessible through a trunk that ran down through the stern, allowing limited inspection while at sea. Using a maintenance light and a dental mirror borrowed from the medical kit, he could see the damage clearly. The portside blade had cracked at the root, probably striking a piece of floating debris or a submerged log, and bent backward at approximately 40-degree angle. The starboard and stern blades were intact. The engineering solution was obvious. Remove the damaged blade entirely, restore balance by removing the opposite blade, and run on 2 blades instead of 3. Propellers regularly lost blades and continued functioning, albeit with reduced efficiency and heavy vibration. It wasn't ideal, but it would get them moving. The problem was also obvious. The propeller was underwater, beneath the stern, accessible only by diving, and the water temperature was 42 degrees Fahrenheit. A man could work maybe 4 minutes before hypothermia set in, maybe 6 if he was tough. The shaft would need to be locked, the blade removed with a hacksaw or cutting torch, and the work done in heavy seas that could crush a diver against the hull. It was dangerous, probably impossible, and absolutely against every regulation in the book. Thomas thought about it for 20 minutes, smoking a cigarette cupped in his hand against the wind, watching the gray water rise and fall against the stern. Then he went to find Chief McAllister. Duncan McAllister was in the engine room, a cathedral of steel and brass that smelled of hot oil and coal smoke. The boiler was banked but still warm, pressure maintained at minimum to keep the auxiliary systems running. McAllister sat on a workbench, drinking tea from a tin cup, his face gray with exhaustion. He'd been awake for 26 hours. "Chief," Thomas said, "I think I can fix the propeller." McAllister looked at him with the patient weariness of a man who'd heard every half-baked idea a creative sailor could devise. "The propeller is underwater, lad. We'd need a dry dock, a crane, and about 2 weeks. We cut the damaged blade off, cut the opposite blade off too for balance, run on 2 blades. McAllister's expression didn't change. "Aye, that would work. If we had a diver, a cutting rig, calm water, and a death wish." He sipped his tea. "The water's 42 degrees. You'd last 4 minutes, maybe 5. Not enough time. I can do it in 3 minutes if we rig it properly. Hacksaw through the root, it's already cracked, won't take much. Then the opposite blade. And what holds you to the ship while you're sawing underwater in 12-foot seas? Safety line and a harness. Someone on deck to pull me up when I signal." McAllister set down his tea. His eyes, red-rimmed from sleeplessness, studied Thomas with sudden intensity. "You've thought this through?" "Yes, Chief. You know this is completely against regulations. No diving operations without proper equipment, trained divers, and medical support. The captain would be court-martialed if anything went wrong. The captain doesn't need to know until after it's done." McAllister was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the ship rolled, and somewhere a loose fitting clanged rhythmically against metal. Finally, the chief engineer said, "If you die, your family gets nothing. Navy won't pay death benefits for unauthorized operations. My dad's a dockyard man. He'll understand. And if you succeed, I'll be the one who let you do it. That's the end of my career." Thomas met his eyes steadily. "Chief, we've got 20 good men who volunteered to stay aboard a dead ship in U-boat waters. If there's even a chance we can move under our own power, we owe it to them to try. And we both know no tug is coming in time." The silence stretched out. Through the open engine room hatch, they could hear voices on deck, the sound of men preparing to transfer to HMS Gladiolus when she returned. Men saying goodbye to shipmates, knowing some of them wouldn't survive the next 3 days. McAllister stood up slowly, his joints cracking. "Right then, we'll need hacksaws, safety lines, a bosun's chair modified as a harness, and 4 strong lads on deck. And we do this at 1600 hours, before Gladiolus arrives, so nobody sees what we're up to." He fixed Thomas with a hard stare. "You get 2 attempts, 3 minutes each. If you're not done in 6 minutes total, we haul you up and forget this foolishness. Understood?" "Understood, Chief." "And Hewitt, if you die, I'm telling your father you slipped and fell overboard. I'll not have him thinking I sent his son to freeze to death on purpose." Thomas smiled grimly. "He'll see right through that, Chief. My dad knows when a man's lying about how someone died." At 1545 hours, with the sky darkening and the wind building to 30 knots, 5 men gathered on HMS Bluebell's afterdeck. Thomas Hewitt stood in his underwear, his body already shaking from cold, as 2 shipmates rubbed his torso vigorously with rough towels, a crude attempt to increase circulation before the dive. Chief McAllister supervised the rigging, a modified bosun's chair strapped around Thomas's chest, connected to 200 feet of 1-inch manila line. 2 hacksaws hung from his belt in waterproof canvas pouches. A third man stood ready with a stopwatch. The plan was simple but brutal. Thomas would go over the stern on a rope, position himself under the propeller housing, and saw through the damaged blade at its root where the crack had already weakened the bronze. Then he'd signal to be repositioned and cut through the opposite blade to maintain balance. 3 minutes per blade. If he took longer, hypothermia would kill him. Lieutenant Commander Thornhill appeared on deck, saw the preparation, and stopped cold. "Chief, what in God's name is going on here?" McAllister turned, his face expressionless. "Emergency propeller maintenance, sir." "The propeller is underwater." "Aye, sir." "And that man is in his underwear in November water." "Aye, sir." Thornhill looked from the chief to Thomas to the rigging, his face working through shock to anger to calculation. He was silent for 10 seconds that felt like an hour. Finally, he said quietly, "If this works, I'll recommend you both for disciplinary action and commendation simultaneously, and let the Admiralty sort it out. If it fails, I'll testify at the court-martial that I ordered you to stop and you refused. Is that clear?" "Perfectly clear, sir," McAllister said. "Then carry on. And Hewitt, good luck, son." At 1547 hours, Thomas Hewitt went over the stern. The cold was a physical blow, like being struck by a club. The water closed over his head, and every nerve in his body screamed in protest. He fought down panic, surfaced gasping, and grabbed the rope. The deck crew lowered him 6 feet, positioning him directly beneath the propeller. He took 3 deep breaths, hyperventilating to load his blood with oxygen, and dove. Underwater, the world was gray-green silence. The hull of HMS Bluebell stretched above him like the belly of a whale. The propeller hung suspended, its bronze blades catching what little light penetrated from the surface. Thomas positioned himself against the shaft housing, braced his feet against the rudder, and drew the first hacksaw. The damaged blade had a 6-inch crack at the root. Thomas positioned the saw and began cutting with long, steady strokes. The bronze was soft compared to steel, but the cold was already affecting his coordination. His hands felt thick and clumsy. After 10 strokes, he had to surface. He gasped air, shaking violently. "More slack," he managed to shout. The deck crew adjusted his position. He dove again. This time he got 20 strokes before the cold forced him up. The blade was halfway through. 1 more dive. On deck, the man with the stopwatch called out, 2 minutes. Thomas filled his lungs and went down for the 3rd time. The world had narrowed to a small circle of gray water, bronze metal, and the rhythmic back and forth of the saw. His body was beyond cold now, moving into that dangerous phase where the brain starts making stupid decisions because it's too frozen to think clearly. He focused everything on the simple mechanical action: pull, push, pull, push. The blade came free with a sudden lack of resistance. Thomas nearly lost his grip on the saw as the severed bronze swung away on its pivot point and dropped into the darkness below. He signaled frantically, 3 hard jerks on the safety line, and the deck crew hauled him up. They pulled him aboard and immediately wrapped him in wool blankets while McAllister rubbed his arms and legs viciously to restore circulation. Thomas's lips were blue, his entire body convulsing with shivers. "1 down," he managed through chattering teeth. "Need 2 minutes to warm, then the other blade." "You're done, lad," McAllister said firmly. "That's enough." "Not balanced. Need to cut. Opposite blade." Thomas forced the words out. 2 minutes. I can do it." They gave him 4 minutes. pouring hot tea into him and rubbing his limbs until some color returned. At 15:53 hours, against every instinct of self-preservation and common sense, Thomas Hewitt went over the stern for a second time. This blade was undamaged, which made it harder. Thomas had to cut through solid bronze, working from the top down, his body pressed against the hull while the sea tried to tear him away. He made 5 dives in total, each one shorter than the last as hypothermia closed its grip. On the 5th dive, his vision started to tunnel, and he knew he was approaching the edge of consciousness. The stopwatch man called, 5 minutes 40 seconds. Thomas made one final cut, felt the blade separate, and pulled himself away before it fell. He signaled to be hauled up, and then the world went gray. He came to on the deck, surrounded by men rubbing his body with towels and forcing hot soup between his lips. Someone had put a wool cap on his head. Chief McAllister's face appeared above him, weathered and grim. "Both blades off clean. You mad, brilliant bastard, can you stand?" Thomas nodded, though he wasn't sure it was true. They helped him to his feet and half-carried him below to the warmth of the engine room. As they descended the ladder, he heard Lieutenant Commander Thornhill's voice on deck. "Chief, test the engines. Let's see if this insanity actually worked." At 16:17 hours, HMS Bluebell's boiler came back to full pressure. At 16:22 hours, Chief McAllister engaged the reduction gear and opened the throttle to 1/4 power. The vibration that ran through the hull was heavy and uneven. A 2-bladed propeller was never going to be smooth, but it was manageable. The shaft turned. The propeller bit water, and slowly, majestically, HMS Bluebell began to move forward. On the bridge, Thornhill felt the deck come alive beneath his feet and allowed himself a smile. He ordered course set for 95 degrees, full speed ahead, chasing after the convoy that had left them behind 8 hours earlier. In the engine room, McAllister watched his gauges with hawk-like intensity, listening to every sound the wounded machinery made. The vibration was within acceptable limits. The bearings were holding. They had power. And in the tiny sickbay, Thomas Hewitt lay wrapped in blankets, drinking hot cocoa, his body still shaking but his eyes clear. The medical officer, a young surgeon lieutenant named Davies, checked his core temperature and pronounced him lucky to be alive. "Hypothermia, exhaustion, and the beginnings of frostbite in your extremities," Davies said, making notes. "You'll need to stay warm and dry for at least 24 hours. No watch duty, no deck work." "Will I keep my fingers and toes?" Thomas asked. Davies smiled. "Yes, you were extraordinarily lucky, or extraordinarily stupid. I haven't decided which." "Both, sir." At 2340 hours, HMS Bluebell rejoined convoy HX-217, taking her station on the port beam of the merchant column. Signal lamps flashed between ships. "Gladiolus to Bluebell. Glad to see you mobile. What happened?" Bluebell to Gladiolus. "Emergency repairs effected. Proceeding with convoy." No mention of how those repairs were accomplished. No mention of an unauthorized dive in 42-degree water. No mention of a young, able seaman who'd cut away a propeller blade with a hacksaw and sheer determination. The convoy reached Liverpool on November 27, 1942, with 41 of its original 43 ships intact, a better survival rate than most. HMS Bluebell went into dry dock for proper propeller replacement, and the dockyard workers who examined her shaft were baffled by the clean, deliberate cuts through the missing blades. This wasn't battle damage. This was surgery. Lieutenant Commander Thornhill filed an official report that was masterfully vague. Propeller damage occurred at 0340 hours November 18th. Emergency field repairs were attempted by engineering crew using improvised methods. Repairs successful. Ship returned to operational status at 1622 hours same date. Request formal inspection of reduction gear for stress damage. The report made no mention of who performed the repairs or what methods were used. The Admiralty, buried under thousands of similar reports from hundreds of ships, stamped it noted and filed it away. Chief Engineer Duncan McAllister was never court-martialed. He received no commendation either. He continued serving on HMS Bluebell until May 1944, when he transferred to a destroyer. He survived the war, retired in 1946, and died in Glasgow in 1963. His service record shows nothing unusual about his time on HMS Bluebell. Able seaman Thomas Hewitt received a letter from Lieutenant Commander Thornhill 3 weeks after they reached Liverpool. It was brief, handwritten, and marked personal. Hewitt. Your initiative on November 18th was unauthorized, dangerous, and saved the lives of 20 men who would have died waiting for a tug that never would have arrived in time. The Navy cannot officially acknowledge what you did, because to do so would be to admit we allowed a grossly unsafe operation. But I want you to know that I will remember what you did for the rest of my life, and I will make damn sure your name appears in my private journal exactly as it happened. You are the kind of sailor who wins wars. I am honored to have served with you. R. Thornhill. Thomas kept the letter for the rest of his life. He survived the war, married a girl from Portsmouth named Margaret, and returned to the dockyards where his father and grandfather had worked. He built ships for 35 years, retiring in 1980. He rarely spoke about his time in the Navy, and when asked about the Battle of the Atlantic, he would usually say something vague about escort duty being cold and wet and mostly boring. But sometimes, late at night, with a glass of whiskey in hand and his grandchildren asleep upstairs, he would tell his wife about a day in November 1942 when he went swimming in the North Atlantic and saved a ship with a hacksaw and determination. It was the cold I remember most, he would say. Not the fear, not the danger, just the cold, like being stabbed with 1,000 knives all at once, and knowing that if I didn't finish cutting that blade, 20 good men were going to die waiting for help that wasn't coming. "Why did you do it?" Margaret asked him once. Thomas thought about it for a long moment. "Because someone had to," he said finally, "and because I knew how." He died in 1998, at age 79, surrounded by family. His obituary in the Portsmouth News mentioned his naval service, but included no details. The generation that fought the Battle of the Atlantic was like that. They did impossible things and then went home and lived ordinary lives and rarely talked about it. HMS Bluebell survived until February 1945, when she was torpedoed and sunk by U-711 off the Kola Peninsula in the Arctic Ocean. 47 of her crew died in the freezing water. The ship went down in 4 minutes. Among the survivors was Chief Petty Officer William Harrison, who'd been one of the men on deck that November day in 1942, holding the rope while Thomas Hewitt dove beneath the stern with a hacksaw. In his later years, Harrison gave interviews to historians documenting the Battle of the Atlantic. He always included the story of the illegal propeller repair. "It was the damnedest thing I ever saw," he told an interviewer in 1987. This kid, and he was just a kid really, 23 years old, going down into 40-degree water with a hacksaw to cut away a propeller blade. We thought he was going to die. We were sure of it. But he went down, and he did the job, and he saved the ship. Saved all of us. And then the Navy pretended it never happened because they couldn't officially admit they'd allowed something so dangerous. The interviewer asked why the story never became widely known. Harrison shrugged. Because there were 1,000 stories like it, 1,000 ships, 1,000 crises, 1,000 young men doing impossible things because if they didn't, someone was going to die. Thomas Hewitt was special, sure, but he was also ordinary. That's what people don't understand about the war. The extraordinary things were done by ordinary people who just decided they weren't going to quit. Travte. In the archives of the Imperial War Museum in London, there is a file marked HMS Bluebell K-80, Maintenance and Repair Records, 1941-1945. Deep in that file, on page 127, there is a single-line entry dated November 18, 1942. Propeller blades removed and replaced. See Dockyard Report, Liverpool. No names, no details, just a bureaucratic notation of routine maintenance. But in the private journal of Lieutenant Commander Richard Thornhill, preserved by his family and donated to the National Maritime Museum in 1982, there is a detailed entry for November 18, 1942. It describes everything: the damaged propeller, the impossible situation, and a young able seaman named Thomas Hewitt, who went into freezing water with a hacksaw because 20 men needed him to. The entry ends with a single sentence: "If Britain survives this war, it will be because of men like Hewitt, not the generals or politicians, but the ordinary sailors who simply refused to quit when quitting was the only sane option." The Battle of the Atlantic was won by March 1943, when improved tactics, better technology, and overwhelming Allied production finally turned the tide against the U-boats. Between 1939 and 1945, the Germans sank 3,500 Allied merchant ships and 175 Allied warships. The Allies lost 36,000 merchant seamen and 36,000 naval personnel. The names of those who died are recorded on memorials in Liverpool, Halifax, and a dozen other ports. They are remembered in ceremonies every year, on days like Battle of the Atlantic Sunday, when aging veterans and their families gather to honor the men who kept the convoys moving. But there are other stories, quieter, less documented, of the men who didn't die because someone refused to accept the inevitable. Men who survived because a chief engineer bent the rules, because a captain looked the other way, or because a 23-year-old deckhand decided that drowning in 42-degree water was preferable to watching his shipmates die, waiting for a rescue that would never come. Thomas Hewitt's story is one of thousands that were never officially recorded, never decorated, never acknowledged by the bureaucracy that would have court-martialed him if he'd failed. It survives in private journals, in interviews given decades later, in family stories passed down through generations. It survives because it matters. Because in the end, wars are not won by grand strategies or superior firepower alone. They are won by the accumulated weight of 10,000 small decisions made by ordinary people in desperate circumstances. Decisions to try when failure seems certain, to act when caution would be safer, to risk everything for shipmates who have become family. Thomas Hewitt went into the freezing North Atlantic with a hacksaw and an idea. He came out having saved a ship, rescued 20 men, and added one more small victory to the balance sheet that would ultimately determine whether freedom or tyranny prevailed. The historians will tell you about the great battles, the famous commanders, the turning points that changed history. But the men who were there will tell you about the deckhand with the hacksaw and the day HMS Bluebell refused to die.